With the international drive to reduce depletion of natural resources and increasing efforts towards sustainable development, renewable energy has come into focus globally. Considering higher increase in energy consumption, India is also looking at ways to alter sources to cleaner and greener energy that will help in building a more resilient future. The country is relying more on solar and wind energy to redirect the transition from non-renewable to renewable energy to achieve the 2050 goals. Especially in critical times like today, when about 50% of India's coal-fired power plants have fuel stocks of less than 3 days, solar energy and other renewable sources have become all the more critical. Switching over to renewable energy and encouraging investments in the sector is not just an internal goal for India, it also aligns with the COP26 goals, where countries have been asked to come forward with ambitious 2030 emission reduction targets that align with reaching net zero target. The energy choices that the country makes now will determine its success in achieving the target of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. Well, before I get to my guests, let's go across to my colleague Sonal Bhutra.
Carbon neutral is the new gold. Nowadays, more and more companies are pledging to become carbon neutral, net zero, or even climate positive. Sustainability and ESG disclosures are becoming an important part of the overall corporate strategy. In fact, in March this year, SEBI decided to introduce sustainability reporting requirements and business responsibility report that would replace business responsibility and sustainability report. This would be applicable to top 1,000 listed entities, that is by market capitalization, with voluntary implementation for FY22 and mandatory implementation from FY23 onwards. Not only disclosures, there is a big push towards investment in ESG stocks as well. A recent Edelweiss report suggested that global sustainable investment that maps sustainable and responsible investments across the world grew 15% to $35 trillion. And if we talk about India, the AUM surged 4 times to $1.6 billion. Of course, this is a small contributor to overall pie, but it indicated that ESG funds are maturing rapidly. There are 10 domestic ESG funds, out of which 8 were launched in the past 1 year itself. The Nifty ESG index has outperformed benchmark Nifty in the past 1 year. This is signifying rising attractiveness of ESG-themed funds. The total AUM stands at 118 billion rupees as on June 2021. Now, there is a constant government push as well. Share of renewables in overall energy mix is given more priority with a 25.24% share in the total generation capacity. The renewables target by the government is 450 megawatts. The government has also announced National Green Hydrogen Mission. Recently, companies like Reliance have committed to new energy with big investments. More companies are joining the fray now. Government is also focusing on increasing consumption of biofuels. To sum it up, global awareness for environment and clean energy, along with the decarbonization commitment, is attracting innovation and investment from all the stakeholders.
Joining us today for this special conversation, Rajat Verma, the MD and Head of Commercial Banking at HSBC, and Sumant, the Chairman and MD of ReNew Power. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the program. Sumant, let me start by asking you, now India ranked 4th in wind power, 5th in solar power, and 4th in renewable power installed capacity as of 2020. A lot has changed over the last 5 years. If you can take us through first a snapshot of the landscape in India, how much has changed, especially in the last 5 years?
Me on the show. Look, to your point, a tremendous amount has changed in the last 5 years. I think that, first of all, the biggest thing that has happened is that renewable energy has become cheaper than any other form of electricity. And therefore, anybody who wants to add new capacity or meet new demand of power, the natural choice now is renewable energy. This is a big difference from 5 years ago, when in fact renewable energy was more expensive and needed mandates like renewable purchase obligation targets and so on to for it to be adopted by distribution utilities. Today, it's the most natural choice for anybody because, as I said, it is cheap. So that's, I think, the first thing that has happened. The second, I think, that has happened is that there is a very significant now mindset shift. People recognize that that we cannot continue to pollute, that carbon emissions need to be controlled, and therefore that we need to fundamentally have different sources of clean energy. And therefore, renewable energy is also, from that standpoint, getting a leg up. The third thing that I think now is beginning to happen is that people are also recognizing that electricity accounts for only a quarter of the total carbon emissions because the energy sector is much broader and much bigger. It encompasses mobility, it encompasses the hard to abate sectors in the corporate side, etc. And so we need to find solutions where we can actually take forward renewable energy into those areas as well, and to clean those sectors also, because as I said, they account for a very significant chunk of carbon emissions.
Yes, as you point out, Sumant, that many of these factors have now come together and they are aiding the momentum as far as the adoption of renewable energy is concerned. But let's just bring up that point about economics, because as you pointed out, it is a lot cheaper today, it is a lot affordable, and that has made the transition and the switch over that much more attractive. The question then is this sustainable, and how much lower can we expect prices to head?
Well, right now we've just crossed the inflection point, and as we keep going forward, things are going to become even more compelling for clean energy and for the green economy as a whole. Technology is not going to stop. Technology evolution is going to continue to happen. The pressure from a climate change standpoint is going to continue to be there. And therefore, I think as we look forward, you will see, I think certainly by 2030, you could see peak coal being reached in India. And from that point on, you'll see more and more renewable energy capacities taking over. And so you'll probably have a situation where by 2040, 2050, most of the energy systems will be based entirely on clean sources rather than on any fossil fuel basis.
Well, that's good to hear. But Rajat, let me address that issue of capital and the capital requirements for this sector going forward. If I were to take a look at just FDI inflow, we've seen an FDI inflow of about $10 billion just between April of 2000 and March of 2021. By 2028, the expectation is that we will need about $500 billion to come into this sector. Now, what does that mean in terms of foreign investment? What does it mean in terms of just the ability for the sector to be able to raise capital?
Almost 40 to 50% of the world's capital, whether it be asset management companies or banks or pension funds, etc., have committed to net zero, have committed a certain percentage of their funds to go into sustainable finance. So clearly, the flow of capital, to my mind, the amount of capital to my mind is not the issue any longer, because you have, let's say 40 to 50 trillion dollars of banks and 40 to 50 trillion dollars of asset management, as a percentage of that industry, saying that we will be lending a fairly significant chunk of our money towards this. I think the more important problem to solve is, do you have all forms of capital? So do you have equity? Do you have mezzanine? Do you have high risk capital? So if you want to develop, let's say, green hydrogen, is there enough capital going into that at an early stage? So for a very well established renewable energy project, which you're off taking with a government off taker, I think capital is quite readily available, as probably Sumant would agree. But you need all forms of capital, and there's another form of capital that you need, which is that as you're transitioning from old sectors, you need to make sure that stranded assets and perhaps even stranded industries are taken care of, and either they are demised quickly or they are funds which take that kind of those assets on their book. So essential point is that you need several pockets of capital to come in, and you've probably seen globally several announcements trying to address all of these areas. So in summary, I think the extent of capital is not a problem. And I've seen some really encouraging signs over the last 6 or 9 months, it's very recent, perhaps as a run-up to COP26, that you're seeing a lot of announcements around funds which are tackling the other problems, perhaps the slightly more difficult problems to sort around this evolution.
Sumant, let me get you to weigh in on that as well. As Rajat was pointing out, capital perhaps less of a constraint today. What are you seeing change within that mix, specifically from an India standpoint?
Well, I think that, first of all, I totally agree with Rajat. There is a tremendous amount of capital that is looking to invest in the sector. So I think as long as the investment opportunities are profitable, as long as the returns are okay, there is no dearth of capital availability. We're also seeing capital go into some of the higher risk areas. And that is why when you look at a lot of the new listings that are happening, these are, fairly early stage battery companies, companies in carbon capture and sequestration, companies looking at green hydrogen. their valuations are very high right now, and that's really a function of the fact that they're actually attracting a ton of capital. So on the equity side, for sure, I don't see any issues. On the debt side as well, as long as the projects are bankable, again, there is a lot of capital that is available and willing to come in. So what are the changes that I see happening, certainly from an Indian context, is that more and more of our funding is really coming from the international bond markets. That is a source that has picked up quite substantially. We are still not seeing enough lending from the banking sector in India happening. We're not seeing enough lending from foreign banks in the sector either. They're not using the balance sheets as actively as they perhaps could, especially in line with some of their global commitments. And that is an area that certainly could be looked at. And I think some of the domestic bond markets are clearly still not actively lending to our sector. So I think there are quite a few pockets of capital that can still come in, and hopefully they will over a period of time come in. And as that happens, we just see more capital availability.
Rajat, given what we just heard there from Sumant in terms of the headroom for growth and the potential for demand to be driven higher, what is that going to mean in terms of the banking sector's ability to be able to support this industry?
So one product which is very popular as a lending product across the world, Shireen, but is practically unheard of in India, is called sustainability linked financing. So essentially, what banks are saying is that, look, you're a FMCG company or you're a pharmaceutical company, but you commit to certain sustainability goals in the next period of time, and the banks will lend to you and will up or increase or decrease your pricing based on whether you reach those goals. There are technical terms for it, which I won't get into. But essentially, that type of financing is increasingly getting, gaining popularity in all parts of the world. And you've nomenclature just defined for it about a year back. To give you a sense, almost in the first half of this year, in the full year, we expect about $500 billion of loans, out of which 80 to 85% of bank loans will be towards sustainability linked loans to sectors which have got nothing ostensibly to do with energy. So the basic message there, which I wanted to make, was that everybody has to contribute towards this. It just can't be large projects supplying into the grid. So this has to ripple into sustainable finance, and renewable energy has to ripple into the whole supply chain, into what we call scope 3, upstream and downstream of companies as well. Because otherwise you'll have FMCG companies saying, look, I've sorted my problem, my footprint is clean. But then what about your suppliers, where 80% of the emission is happening? So that's really what I think we need to get into. And I think in that context, we are a couple of years as a financing setup, we are a couple of years behind the rest of the world.
And time to play catch up there. But Sumant, let's address the issue of targets. And you talked about that 450 gigawatt target that India hopes to achieve by 2030. Now, as of July 2021, we're about 96.96 gigawatts. The renewable energy capacity has seen a fairly fast pace of growth over the last few years. I think a CAGR of about 15% in the last few years. Where do you believe we're likely to be in the short term? Forget the 450, but where do you believe we're likely to be in the short term? What is achievable? What is doable? And more importantly, from ReNew's point of view, what are the targets that you're focusing on?
I think on 30 gigawatts or 35 gigawatts, that has been auctioned off, and that number is increasing regularly. And all of this capacity has to be up and running in the next year and a half or thereabouts. So I would be not surprised if we cross without hydro about 150, 175 gigawatts in the next couple of years' time. So I would say that we are well on our pace to achieving those numbers. But I think what's also happening behind that, Shireen, is that we are also changing the industry from one which is based on imports of equipment to one that is going to be based more and more on domestically manufactured equipment. And I think that is going to be very healthy. The second thing that is also happening is that we are going to be getting into other areas of energy, as Rajat was talking about, the hard-to-abate areas, the mobility sector, etc., through things like green hydrogen and electric vehicles. That is a shift that is also going to be gathering pace. over the next 3 to 5 years. And so I think that all of these changes will really gather a lot more momentum over the next 4 or 5 years. And I think 2025 is going to be a time when we'll probably be at about 200 to 150 gigawatts, something in that range, well on our way to meeting the 2030 numbers. Our targets, Shireen, are that we intend to get to about 18 gigawatts by 2025. That's what we've talked about. That's what we are funded for at this point in time. So that's what we're hoping to achieve.
And you talked about some of the future opportunities, things like green hydrogen, etc. We've already seen many of the big boys announce their plans. Companies like Reliance, Adani, talking about the future, which includes things like green hydrogen. Is that something that you may want to consider?
No, of course we'll consider getting into green hydrogen as well. And I think the question is you don't have to necessarily announce something. It's, I think, more important to go out and get it done. So I think that's really where I focus.
Okay, Rajat, you talked about how we need to ensure that the focus is not just on making the transition to renewable energy, but also non-energy players making the shift and the transition to much more sustainable ways of doing business. Take me through what you have, for instance, been able to do as a corporation yourselves, and more importantly, what the focus areas will be going forward.
So there's some examples in India, but several dozens of examples all over Asia and all over the world, Shireen, where we've been discussing with companies who are in several industries, Sumant, for example, or manufacturing, where talking to them and talking about their transition plans, this is a very important issue for them. They have reporting in their respective jurisdictions as well. So our discussion with them has been that how should we, either as a lender or to take them to investors, position their story and their hypothesis of sustainability appropriately, how to measure it, how to record it, and perhaps even how to reward them for it as well. So that has been probably a very significant movement as far as I can see in the bank. Our own institution, of course, has committed $1 trillion by 2030 to this area. We've already financed $87 billion. And just to give you a sense of how this has moved, earlier we had said by 2025 we're going to do $100 billion. That number changed from 100 billion to $1 trillion by 2030. So you can see that the goalposts are moving in the right direction and exponentially. So and I have no doubt at all that we will, we are well on our way as well. And it's very important that as an institution, we tackle, as I mentioned before, some of the other forms of capital that are required here, because it's not just as a bank that you go and lend or as a bond house that you go and arrange, but you have to have a little bit of different thinking. We mentioned stranded assets, but also maybe venture debt at an early stage, or maybe equity contribution, or sometimes at the highest risk element, perhaps just corporate social responsibility. And you would find that we've public commitments and large amounts of capital dedicated to all of these ideas as well, along with other institutions, that we've partnered. In some ways, there's a lot of competition, perhaps for, I wouldn't say competition, but there's a lot of sort of healthy movement towards wanting to do more, because bankers, I think, bankers like me, bankers all over the world are also seeing this as as not only a commercial opportunity, which it is, but also as an opportunity to do good. So it's very rare that in a career you come across this combination at such scale. So certainly, it is an exciting space.
Well, nothing wrong with healthy competition if it's spurring people to do better. So more power to healthy competition in this space. But Sumant, I'm going to give you the final say now. In terms of policy changes, in terms of regulation, where things currently stand, what would you like to now see being prioritized? We've seen the draft rules as far as the open access rules are concerned. What will that mean, in terms of the consumer segment, for instance? Leave us with your thoughts on changes in policy and regulation as we move forward.
Yeah, Shireen, by and large, the government has been very proactive and I think quite enlightened in terms of the overall changes that they made to the sector, certainly to encourage renewable energy, to create the right enabling framework and the right structure to allow more and more renewables to get absorbed into the system. I think the one area where certainly we still need to see more work is in the area of reforming the distribution utilities, because that's one part of the power sector value chain that meets the customers and collects the money which comes into the rest of the sector. And if that part of the value chain is not healthy, then that impacts everybody else in the chain. And also it prevents us from making the kinds of investments that are required on upgrading our grids, on having more digital capabilities, on giving customers more value-added services. So there's a lot of things that can be done at the distribution end, at the last mile end facing customers, which is currently being prohibited because distribution utilities are owned by state governments. So I think delicensing the sectors, privatizing the utilities is absolutely, absolutely essential, without which I don't think the sector is going to be able to achieve a lot of the promise and potential that certainly exists. Now, the Electricity Act amendment that the government is talking about coming out with proposes these changes, and one would hope that the Electricity Act amendment gets passed as quickly and speedily as possible.
Yes, the hope and the expectation was that it would have gone through in the previous session of Parliament. That didn't happen. The expectation now is that it will be taken up in the winter session of Parliament. Let's see if we meet that date. Sumant, Sinha and Rajat, always a pleasure. Many thanks for joining us here on The Making to take us through your thoughts on the future for India's renewable energy sector, and more importantly, how we can grow as an economy in a much more sustainable way. Appreciate your time. Thanks very much for joining us.